this is a huge generalisation, but I feel like writers are people that observe things, and people who write poetry specifically, I feel like are very good at observing people or feeling things, so I feel like we all are good at gauging the room as well, so I feel like it's quite open, but in a safe way, not in a, oh, what's going to happen kind of way.
I think they're open to everybody, but I think they're also a bit intimidating because there is something about going, oh, it's an open mic night, that makes it feel a bit like you have to put on a show, and not everyone wants to put on a show.
Open mic should be open, it should be a space where we can come and share, but I think it should be, you can come and share even if you've never read your words out loud before. Even if you're a published poet, even if you have never deemed yourself a poet until tonight, but you're daring to come onto the mic, it's an open space for you. We're not coming in and being like, okay, prove to me, how many poems have you written?
I'd like to say that they're super open, but I do think that there's a culture around them that means that some people don't feel like they'd be open to them. The scene it's heavily under 40, it's university educated, it's quite middle class in a lot of ways, and I've spoken to a lot of people who thought, before they went especially, that it wouldn't be open to them in that way.
When an event has such a strong style, certain poets feel like they can't be there, or that their style is not well received. So I might go to an event and be like, oh, there's only this certain style being showcased, maybe my thing won't be there or won't be well received, so I'll continue to look elsewhere.
Different spaces cultivate different vibes, and some places do have it can feel impenetrable just because they have a series of regulars, and if you're a new person to that space, you might not feel super confident performing in places that already have in-jokes, but that doesn't mean you're not welcome there, and it doesn't mean that eventually you won't feel comfortable enough to get on a stage and perform.
Especially if I'm going to an event that isn't the one that I co-host, it's like, I get quite nervous, is this going to be too much, or is this going to be too sad or dramatic, or what are people going to think of this one? And then you go to it and you hear other people's work and you realise it's actually a lot more open. Then I think that's one of the nice things about it, is that it's just people coming together and sharing what it feels like to be human in whatever year we are, and through your eyes, and that's quite a nice thing. So I think they're all generally more open than I think they are.
If you don't find a platform that has your people, your tribe, go create it. And that's the thing about poetry post-COVID, is that a lot of poets that I went on the open mics with are now creating their own platforms, and it's beautiful.
This first poem is about a piece of salmon that I bought that was really expensive and it got on my nerves. And it's called Fucking at the Fish Counter. Wild or Atlantic, he asks, wielding his machete. Great striped apron coming in and out like the tide. Weren't vertical stripes supposed to make you look thin, I think, as you slip your tongue on mine like the tentacles of that octopus, which feels like too much of an animal to fall under my flimsy veil of pescatarianism.
I think none of us can avoid being open when we write. I feel like writing in particular, along with a lot of art forms, is very exposing, even if you don't realize how exposing it is. Sometimes you cannot avoid exposing your heart because you've written something that is very personal.
You want to be able to give as many people a space as possible. Now, obviously, there is immediately a huge caveat next to that, where there is no racism, no transphobia, no sexism, no any picking on people who are from protected characteristics or whatever. You just don't do it. You can't do it in a workplace, you can't do it at an entertainment space. Why would you?
Sometimes the only way you can articulate yourself is through art, or you don't have the means to be going and paying a therapist like £300 a session to speak on something. And at least this allows you to find community in the room who would relate to your experience and be able to provide you a solidarity kind of support that at least allows you to say, I have been heard, and the next time I will cultivate this poem more, or I will edit this poem more to be a refined piece of art rather than an outcry of the help that I need.
But then you have, if you have a poet who is coming in to talk about really, really heavy subjects all the time, from a position of trauma and not of healing, then do you let that person speak all the time? The question itself is at risk of being mired by this question about quote unquote trauma porn inside of the world of spoken word and poetry. And I think it's more of an issue in the world of slam. I mean, for myself personally, I have a poem that I've performed before about a friend of mine who took their own life. And I did perform that at slams previously, and now I don't because it feels icky to use my friend's passing to win points.
This first poem has trigger warnings for grief, and I wrote this recently because I thought that someday I might need it myself. And it's called Ventricular Defect. I will never forget the moment I learnt that a heart can survive with a hole in it. Not a metaphorical absence, although time has proven these can be survived also, but a physical gap between chambers, an abundance of blood flowing in the wrong direction. If untreated, this can cause the right side of the heart to work too hard, growing larger over time, and this becoming weak, and this weakening is not intentional or failure, rather symptomatic of a blind eye turned away from murmuring.
I think the issue about content is really tricky, and even just something that's, I think, fairly benign nowadays, like content warning, trigger warning. Do you do them? Do you need to do them? Do you need to ask people to do them? That kind of thing. Personally, I think if people want to do them, that's fine. If people prefer that everybody does them, that's also fine.
If you're going to share something that you think might be controversial, it's a good idea to just kind of put a little warning, and, you know, anyone who needs to leave while I'm speaking about this, please leave. And it's for entertainment, after all, but it's also for self-expression, so it's tricky. That's not the best answer I've ever given, Tyrone. Yeah, I'm going to leave it there.
Trigger warnings are fantastic, we should be using them, but there's a risk of them becoming too... How do we phrase that? What's the word I'm looking for? Too off the cuff? Like, they're meant, but they can be almost throwaway, because they are said so frequently that the person in the audience isn't digesting what that actually means. So we need to make sure that, and I don't know how we do that, but there is space for that at an event.
Even just generally giving a synopsis of what a poem's about, because what you see as a content warning isn't always what other people do. I've had some examples where I'm like, oh, I didn't know this was going to come up. I kind of wished I knew.
There is definitely, on the level of the individual artist, there is definitely a amount of care that you owe your audience.
Often a lot of these people are being vulnerable in ways that they probably wouldn't even be to their own friends and family. And that's what makes a poetry open mic night so different, is that it might be people that you see 2 to 3 times a month. It may be people that, although you see and get on with, you don't necessarily speak to beyond that. But there's a trust, and I think that openness comes from around that.
The thing that's so unique about open mics and poetry nights in general is that it isn't like a stage. You're not watching a play. There is a relationship more explicitly with the audience. Oftentimes you can see the audience. Oftentimes the audience are your friends or your peers or people that you've seen, or that duty of care goes a long way.
This year, a lot of people have been noticing, and I have been doubling down on wearing pink gloves a lot. I've got a whole host of them, and I've been buying them this year. This set is my mum's. On the 2nd of January this year, my mum passed from stage 4 terminal cancer. This last poem is about my mum. She taught me Sarkhan before she taught me how to walk. Made sure I knew I was a Tottenham fan before I knew my times table, and she showed me Star Wars before she showed me how to dress. And my mother has a TARDIS heart. It may not look like much from the outside, but best believe it is bigger on the inside. And I have been lost. Done all of its hallways for all of space and time, but still keep finding new doors to explore. And I'm sorry, Falcor, but her love is more never-ending than your story. It's more unbreakable than your movie, M. Night, and it's serving more realness than any look I've seen served on the main stage of RuPaul's Drag Race. And yes, that does include you, Simone and Bimini.
I think, in theory, it has to be as open as it can possibly get from the open mic scene in London, or at least the events that I've been to, they pretty much felt like that.
The open mic night can have so much openness, right? In that there's freedom of speech always, but that doesn't mean there's freedom from consequence.
Open doesn't necessarily mean like not open to criticism, in the sense that, you know, when people talk about like almost like with the idea of like free speech, and it's like you can have free speech and you could go up and say something, but it doesn't mean that people aren't allowed to tell you not to.
I think the openness is good because it allows people freedom to talk about whatever they want to talk about. But I also think there has to be a thing of respect, both on the part of the poet and on the part of the audience. And of like, not just sort of respect, but also people, you know, being very aware of their surroundings.
Your freedom ends where another person's begins. Like, I hate the idea of people being too weak or too snowflakey to handle something. People handle things all the time. You want to run a night, you want people to come to that night. If people don't feel safe coming to that night, then people aren't going to come.
I think people who set up an open mic night, people who run these, it's not something you do to make any money, it's something you do for the love of it. And so the people who are minded to do that are minded to make sure that everyone attending is having a good time. The safety, the safe space, the socialness, the togetherness is sort of in the ethos of an open mic night in its very nature.
It's 4 a.m. I've just fucked a stranger in a garden at a house party. He compliments my tits and ass and tells me I taste good. It's a Wednesday. I meet a man in front of the Manor House Travelodge. We go up to his room and fuck twice. He told me his name was Carl, but after 3 pints at the pub downstairs, he's calling himself Dan. There's a poet in my DMs trying to fuck me, but he's also trying to fuck my friend. He cancelled with me last week. He asked to see her this weekend. I blocked someone on Instagram because he is all unsolicited dick pics and no substance. Now he's messaging me on Facebook. Who does that?
Ooh, now we're getting into sort of censorship zones. I'm a big fan of free speech. I think we should be able to hear everybody all the time, regardless of how controversial their opinions or their pieces might be. I think if we don't hear them, we don't know where the moles to whack-a-mole are.
I generally don't like policing people and telling them what not to say. I feel like you should be as open as possible to be able to express what you need, and I feel like sometimes people will overstep and say things that are inappropriate and hurtful, and I feel like sometimes, even though it can be hurtful for people in the audience, maybe that's important that someone gets the chance to be told that this is not okay.
I think if we don't hear like the provocative stuff, then we're kind of keeping ourselves in a bit of a bubble, and we don't always know that there are a lot of people who think differently to us.
In terms of like whether people should be allowed to voice any opinion or say whatever they want, I mean, I always hope that the kinds of people who come to poetry events are sort of like better than that. And on the whole, you tend to not get people that are as weird as like comedians can be.
The best open mics that I have ever attended have always drawn enormous strength from the fact that anybody can show up and do their stuff. The openness of it means that you will get quite a lot of stuff that will not necessarily vibe with you and that might leave you quite cold. I have definitely seen some stuff at open mics that has left me tilting my head. You kind of just have to accept that that's the price of admission.
With that being said, if you go to an open mic night as an audience member looking for a night of entertainment, and if you want to feel safe and you want to feel secure and then you're sharing something quite vulnerable, I think it's really important that you're in a space where you know that you're not sharing a stage with someone that you fundamentally disagree with.
Unfortunately, since not everyone is on the same page about certain things, you need to enforce some stuff and make sure that like everyone can have a good night and be okay.
Sometimes there have been poets that have done poems that make me uncomfortable. Usually they're men being really like macho and like alpha energy, and I'm just a bit like, okay, this is not the space.
Like, I know it should be open and everyone should have an opportunity to speak, but also those kinds of people already occupy so much space outside of this.
This next poem is new shit. And it's not based on a real person. This poem's called Hurt People, and the first line will require me to assume the persona of a heterosexual man, so just give me a second. Hurt people, he says, smugly, pausing to reposition his zin. And I feel like a trampoline without a net, like a landmine, like an autopiloted Tesla approaching a middle school. Like a fully wound machine built for violence, like a self-fulfilling prophecy.
How do we create a space where people feel brave enough to share their work whilst also acknowledging that we feel it's important morally to sort of say this is not appropriate?
I think you need to create a space where people feel okay with being vulnerable.
One thing that I like specifically about the poetry scene and the open mic scene in London, from what I know, is that it's very inclusive of everyone. What I found is that it's inclusive, but it has that element of pretty much every poetry night I will go to will specify no kicking down.
I've never been to a poetry night where I've gone, I think the rules restrict it too much, because often those rules are put in there for safety.
Well, that's the difficulty, because I'm not really into censorship, but I'm also not into being disrespectful and triggering, creating, performing something that could potentially be triggering to people. Now that I'm running my own open mic night, I don't really set ground rules, but I just talk about being respectful and think about the work and the words that you're saying.
I think an open mic night that doesn't have any sort of stated code of conduct or agreements or anything like that is less open. I think it might, in theory, feel more open because it's a sort of free-for-all of you can say whatever you want. There's no restrictions on time or whatever, whatever that is. But it does mean that there are people that will be excluded from that.
To keep everybody safe, you need rules, and you need, not rules, boundaries and parameters. And if you're not sure, then it should be a space where we can ask questions and we can get things wrong. Where we can say something and go, this allyship that you're doing is great, but this bit feels performative. I don't know if we're bold enough to say those kind of things to each other.
There are too many performative poets. I mean, all poets on stage perform, but there are too many poets saying things they don't mean to get clicks. There are too many virtue signalling poets. There are too many allies that aren't really allies. There are too many fair weather friends. There are too many predatory poets. There are too many predatory poets we don't know about. There are too many male poets pretending to be good people while actually being awful. There are too many poets who are so woke on stage then hurt people behind closed doors. There are too many shit people doing poetry. You don't want anyone coming in and making a space feel unsafe. You always have to draw a line. If you're saying something out of line, I'm going to get rid of it because this is the place where I want people to feel safe. I want them to be able to share. And you have to draw that line because you can ask people to be nice, but if you get a racist coming in, he's only nice to the people he thinks deserve to be nice.
And obviously if people are being a dickhead or punching down or being racist, homophobic, transphobic, we just, no tolerance for intolerance.
Yeah, it's like how open is society, you can't be a dick. That's just the general, I think it's more just don't go in there and make a group of people feel uncomfortable with what you're gonna say. Whenever I host an open mic, I always go no hate speech or we shut that down, and I never feel like I'm doing a disservice to free speech or free performance because it's tolerating intolerance isn't good either. So just shut up if you're gonna be a dick, basically, that's what I think.
I cannot stress enough how it is impossible to be inclusive to absolutely everyone. You make decisions about who you want to be and what your resources are to provide that. For example, Process is actively exclusive of far-right political viewpoints. We say that at the start of the night. We make a lot of jokes about kicking down, to Tories, because the night is run by and frequented by people that are
currently at massive risk to, from far right violence that are historically marginalised. That's, we've sort of branded ourselves as the night for neurodivergent queer people, run by a black man and a Jewish whatever, whatever I am. That's the kind of thing we stand for and against, like, bigots aren't welcome at our night. We are actively exclusive to those people. Does that all make sense? Does that answer the question? Yeah.